Thanks for being here, Renee. I was introduced to your work through Destin, who's Smarter Every Day on YouTube and does amazing work himself. But some background for listeners, you're the former technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Your expertise is in online manipulation, so disinformation, harassment, and so on. And over recent years, which we're going to dive into today, you've dove deep into the dynamic between three key players that you believe everyone should have an understanding of, which are influencers, algorithms, and online crowds, because they now shape our information environment and therefore our sense of reality. So my first question, just paint the picture for everyone, is distinguishing the difference between a typical user online and an influencer, because I feel like the lines are increasingly blurred. More people are having public accounts, and with the interest graph recommendation algorithms, it's like anyone can go viral overnight and become powerful in a moment. So how do you make that distinction between the two?
Yeah, and some of it is pretty random. I think the current meme is, of course, the Haktua girl, right? So, who, yes, as I recall, now has representation and is doing the podcast rounds. You never know what's going to do it. Mm-hmm. No, I think influencers are people who are highly relatable, right? They're the name itself actually came from marketing. The idea that there are people who are influential, meaning they have the capacity to make others take an action, right, in sort of its simplest, most academic form. And what that means is there were people who were just good at being online, right? They just know how to communicate well. They're creative. They're funny. A lot of them are attractive. They set out to be seen. They want, they're outgoing, gregarious. They want to be in the conversation. And one of the things that marketers realized very early on, as far back as around 2012, is that they also potentially have the power to help marketers push products. So you really see the influencer come out almost as this commercial figure. So people who are innately online, who also then turn it into something a little bit more. Oftentimes they are trying to monetize their content. They are trying to, to make their audience they communicate to their audience about a thing that they're passionate about, but it is also oftentimes a little bit more than just somebody who's enthusiastic, because it is a business or a career or something that they are trying to professionalize.
Within your book, Invisible Rulers, there are a few terms that continuously come up, and I feel like I just want to run through about 5 of them, define them up front so that there's no question marks for listeners. First, invisible rulers.
So that's a reference to Edward Bernays in 1929. He wrote a book called Propaganda. He had been a propagandist in World War I. And at the time, the term wasn't really a pejorative. His job was to sort of sell the war to the American public, right? And this was a thing that at the time they thought was actually a responsible government should be doing that, right? This was something that was seen as a unifying kind of form of bringing together the country, but also a way to communicate to people who might not have the time or the interest or the ability to see all sides of an issue, the ideas that the government presents it to you. And of course, we see that as very paternalistic now, but Bernays used the term invisible rulers to describe the people who did that work. And he meant, the specific sentence, I think, is they're invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. Our minds are made up by largely men that we've never heard of. And he's talking about the people behind the politicians, behind the brands, the people whose job it is to sell an idea or a product to the public by making them think that they've always wanted it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to someone who used to work as a producer on like one of the late night shows, and he was talking about how, some of the hosts are they act as actors, and there's the people behind them who are just basically like feeding them the lines. Some of them are, more involved, but some of them, just want to be the mouthpieces and want to be the entertainers. And I was like, that is so interesting. I thought they were more involved. Like, I know there's writers and everything, but some are and some aren't. So regarding invisible rulers. But next, propaganda.
Yeah, so I think in its simplest term, you can think about it as information with an agenda. Propaganda is usually described as being deliberate and systematic. And since World War II or so, it does have a connotation of being manipulative in some way. So the information is either not fully portrayed, right? Things are left out. The intent is to shape beliefs or to drive a person to action. And so oftentimes the information is not presented in a simple factual way, but rather it's presented in a way to appeal to the audience that's going to hear it, to make them move in that direction or to activate them. but it is something that serves the agenda of the creator. So there is a motive or a desire behind it.
I feel like throughout your book, it was also very matter of fact the way you talk about propaganda. When we think about that word, even if people don't know the mechanics of it, when you just hear that word, you think of negative. You think of like psyop energy, all this different stuff. Do you think that's the outlook people should have, is just completely negative?
It's an interesting question. The word was used originally, it comes from Latin, propagare, to propagate, right? And so it's a term that came about after the Protestant Reformation. Pope Gregory and the Catholic Church, he compels the cardinals, you must go out and propagate the message of the one true faith, bring the people back into the fold is how the term is originally used. And it's an imperative. He's emphasizing that you must do this. That's the sort of the conjunction of the verb and the way that he uses it is very much like, you've got to do this. This is critically important. And for a long time, that was what it meant, right? An obligation. Like you're pushing a message out of a sense of obligation that you must do it. And that's where that incentive behind it comes from. I think at this point, I understand you're not going to get away from the pejorative connotations, but I do think that we're in a different media environment now, and we are in a space where so many more people have the power of persuasion, and the line between persuasion and propaganda, again, is often very blurry. Sometimes it's described as just, in persuasion, you're presenting all of the facts, and then the person makes a judgment, whereas in propaganda, it's now seen, part of the term is that there's some sort of element of manipulation or some sort of power differential there. It's not me trying to persuade you as equals. It's me as a government or me as a powerful figure trying to convince you that you should see things my way. And that's where that sense of, it not being entirely neutral comes from.
This one comes up a lot in today's environment, the rumor mill.
Yeah, rumors are, this is something that I had, we've all heard the word rumor. And when you say it to somebody, everybody knows, right? It's like, oh, it's like gossip, and you pass something along. You hear something and you share it, right? Maybe it's something about a person's relationship. That's a very common one. Or somebody who did a thing that they weren't supposed to, right? Or an insinuation that something's not quite above board. What's really interesting about rumors when you get into the more kind of formal study is that they're seen as kind of part and parcel to oral culture, right? When you tell stories, and in the pre-media days, it was us communicating with each other. Hey, did you hear? And that movement, right? They were often geographically confined, or maybe you would call someone on the telephone, but there was some sort of network of personal relationships underpinning that rumor mill. Sometimes you'd see gossipy papers write about them, the tabloids that we've all seen. But the notion of the rumor is information that is kind of counter to the official narrative. And that became more and more of a divide as media professionalized. And you had, of course, the tabloid class of media, but you also had like, quote unquote, like real journalism, right? That actually tried to get out there and find out the facts of the matter. And that process took time, right? That process of like fact checking something, trying to get to the heart of the matter when it was important, was a professional process. It became a professional process. Whereas the rumor mill was like, I trust you, you trust me, I hear this thing from you. And because I think you're credible, or I find the story like sensational and wild and everybody needs to hear it, I'm going to spread it along. So it's just this difference between the official narrative and the thing that we all hear and feel compelled to pass on. And it's interesting in the age of social media because that's basically what we're doing when we see this, you see something wild hit your feed and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to share that too, right? It's almost like a reflex. You're going to click the retweet button if it makes your enemies look bad and your friends look good. And it is, in a sense, just a rumor mill on steroids, just a technologically enhanced rumor mill.
You talked about how you felt like maybe people would think this distinction between these things is like unnecessarily niche, but I don't think so at all. And I think it's a really helpful depiction of like a rumor versus misinformation versus disinformation.
With misinformation, the implication is that there's like a fact that is wrong, right? There is something that we know and the information in front of us contradicts that. And so that's where you can say like, no, that's wrong. And a fact checker can go and say, no, that's wrong, or you can community note it or however you address it. But there's a thing to respond to. In the book, I do go into things like the vaccine, vaccines and COVID. The rumors come up a lot in that chapter. And that's because when we talk about vaccine misinformation, what we meant, particularly prior to COVID, was information that we have, for decades of established research have shown, for example, that vaccines do not cause autism, right? That is not a rumor, that is misinformation. When what you start to see, though, is when you can't know the facts yet, and people hear something compelling and then they go on and share it. A nurse faints when she gets her vaccine, and all of a sudden the rumor mill is off to the races about what was in it, what happened to her, did she die? They decide she died, And so this entire construct about this person is fully formed long before any journalist can get out there and find out the facts. And there will eventually be information and misinformation, but not in that moment. And then disinformation has always been used, and I think should be used, to refer to something where there's like a deliberate intent to mislead, right? That's where it's not accidental at all. It's intentional, and it often can happen. Sometimes it's a false claim. Sometimes it's a false identity, right? What we saw with Russia in 2016 was Russians pretending to be Texas secessionists. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a Texas secessionist. That's a perfectly legitimate political viewpoint.
Wait, what is that?
Oh, it argues that Texas should secede from the United States.
Oh, okay.
Yes. There's a passionate group of people who believe that in Texas. Just like there are.
I was hearing
California.
a completely different, like, tech and like.
Oh,
like,
sorry.
I was like, wait, what? Okay, yes.
No, Texas state secessionism. We also have this in California. I think we have it in New York too. There's just these people who really believe that big states need to secede from the union. That's a perfectly legitimate political viewpoint, and people who express that opinion are expressing a perfectly legitimate opinion. The disinformation part is when somebody who is not even an American is pretending to be a Texas secessionist to put forth the Texas secessionist opinion. So the problem there is that the account is itself fake, right? And that's where the deception comes into play, even if the opinion or the content that it's saying is pulled from real people.
We're going to get into that topic. That one really fascinates me. And then lastly, to lay out on the table, bespoke realities, if I said that correctly.
Bespoke is a term you hear a lot in tailoring. Get a bespoke suit, Mm-hmm. You customize it to be exactly what you want it to be. It's sort of tailor-made for your physique and your tastes. And so bespoke realities was a phrase that I started using to describe the idea that you could surround yourself with alternative facts, so to speak, or influencers who are going to tell you what you wanted to hear. The algorithm would, in fact, continue to feed you that after you indicated a preference for it, and that you could immerse yourself in an entire universe of media and online camaraderie and groups in which the thing that you believed was completely real to you, even if the things even if the facts within it diverge from what most people on the outside would consider to be reality. So it was trying to reflect the idea of echo chambers, where people tend to distrust things that are on the outside. What you see with bespoke realities is that phenomenon. It's the co-creation of reality with people who are in the community. So it's a little bit more than just the information coming in. It's actually how you process the stories and the claims and the things that you hear around you, and the ability that we have to put ourselves into particularly siloed spaces that are often in pretty sharp contrast with what people on the outside believe.
Last year, you had a piece, and this quote stood out to me, where you said, "Positioning of new niche media as a de facto wholesome antithesis to the mainstream propaganda machine is a marketing ploy." Last year, I had the opportunity to interview Noam Chomsky about manufacturing consent, and this book is just feels like the modern day extension of that, 100%. And I think one of my favorite things in order to visualize the landscape we're in, especially for those who have grown up with the internet and they don't know any other media landscape outside of social media, is painting the picture that you did so beautifully in your book of how propaganda has evolved and the outlook of it has evolved, from Walter Lippmann, who coined the phrase the manufacturing of consent in the 1920s, Edward Bernays a bit later, and then Chomsky and Herman, and how you view it today. Just that evolution, I would love for you to
depict. That was, so I started off, when I decided I wanted to do a book, I wanted to do it on propaganda. Mm-hmm. And that was in part because I felt like I spent 5 years at Stanford, and prior to that, about 5 years as an activist, through a group of Data for Democracy and a bunch of these different sort of smaller spaces, watching this world evolve and feeling increasingly like words like misinformation and disinformation, particularly as there would be these debates about when to apply them, were foundationally missing the point. Again, it was because both of those tend to be thinking in terms of facts and authenticity, right? Which is fine. It's fine to have those conversations, but it was missing the broader point, which was like why this was happening, right? And that was that people had realized that social media platforms were incredibly powerful, particularly for galvanizing people to action. One of the things that I think propaganda literature in the 1960s talked about, I get into Jacques a little bit in there as well, what Ellul argues is that you're no longer trying to persuade people necessarily. You're trying to activate them, right? You're trying to take people who already have a sensibility to reinforce that belief, those sensibilities, and then to make them take action. And I wanted to write about how that worked in this information environment. Chomsky in Herman's book, Manufacturing Consent, takes the phrase that, again, this was kind of what I was alluding to with Bernays, this idea that the government has an obligation, in fact, to help you decide what to think or to help you process the facts of the world. The reason for that, and the term that Lippmann comes up with, is manufacturing the consent of the governed, by which he means, and this again in the 1920s to 30s does not have quite the same valence it does today. It's the idea that people think and feel in different worlds but live in the same one, is how he puts it, and the government's job is to bring them into that same one. And I felt like we had reverted back into that, that thinking and feeling in different worlds, but with no mechanism for creating that consensus at this point. Chomsky's book is a book about incentives, and it explains why the mass media produces the outputs that it does, right? And so it goes into things like advertisers are a huge function in media determining what to cover. They want to appeal to the advertisers. So if, for example, pharmaceutical companies are advertisers, they don't want to critique pharma too much, right? They might not want to criticize Pfizer if Pfizer is buying ads.
Even if it's not outright, it's like that self-censorship of it.
Right, yeah. Exactly. And you see that self-censorship also, he talks about sourcing being another thing that really shapes what media covers, meaning if your sources are highly placed government officials and you want to maintain those relationships, you might pull punches when criticizing the entity that one of your sources is affiliated with in some way. He talks about the need to create an other, right, to create tension. So at the time, it was anti-communism. And, as a lot of the case studies that Chomsky's talking about, you have anti-communism. And then he kind of talks about this after September 11th. He did a bunch of interviews talking about how instead of the communists, then it was the terrorists, right? And so Islam and Islamic fundamentalism, and how media creates these neat us versus them dichotomies. And if you go on social media, really, that's all we have at this point, right? There is always an enemy. There is your faction, and then there are all of those other factions. The factions are constantly at war. And the incentive structure for a lot of the creators is to keep that going, right? It is very similar. You have your audience that is literally patronizing you by subscribing to your Substack. You are incentivized to tell them what they want to hear. So I just wanted to write a book about what are the incentives in this new media environment, particularly because, as with what you started your question, I always think it's funny when you have both the "we are the media now" attitude, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of like mainstream media is old, it's out of date, it's not relevant, it doesn't speak for the people, et cetera, et cetera. We are the media now. But then also they are constantly positioning themselves through these sort of rants and screeds against the media. And so you just, it started to feel very, very sort of transparent and fake. It's clearly a marketing ploy at this point, unfortunately. It's just positioning yourself as the truth teller and everybody else as the liars. And that really seems to work for a lot of people. It's very much entrenchment into an ideological niche. And when you're constantly competing for attention, your incentive is to appeal to the niche, not to appeal to the broad mainstream, because you're not going to be able to reach them. That's just not how the internet is structured.
There are independent journalists on platforms, whether it's YouTube, only a handful that do like deep investigative journalism, because it's really hard with social media incentives. It's more post every day, especially in your growth phase, like really grow this audience, just put as much out there as possible. focus on, yes, of course, quality, but like quantity is really important, especially at the start for growth. And you talk about how institutions are really important for investigative journalism. And as, the internet rose, social media rose, then commentary and analysis content is, what thrived there. And specifically people on the right talk against legacy media and, media elite. But you made the point of like an average salary for the New York Times journalist, or I don't know if it's average, but like you can maybe expect to make $100K. And then someone like Glenn Greenwald was making potentially $2 million a year, up to $2 million on his Substack. So it's like, yeah, these independent media are elite media in a lot of ways too, and they have these connections with billionaires or whatever it is, and there can still be those incentives. And also within independent media, you constantly use legacy media reporting in a good way. I don't know too much about Glenn Greenwald, but other people I've watched, whether it's Daily Wire or whatever, are constantly referencing the investigative reporting to support their analysis and commentary. I'm like, to do what you do every day, you also need that institutional backing, and not backing, but like that dynamic, which is
100%. It's the underpinning. It's I think one of the examples that I think should make this clear to people was right around the 48 hours or so around October 7th, right? Where the people who actually, you had some on the ground first person footage, of course, right? Particularly coming out of Telegram. A lot of what began to happen though was there were a couple things. First, there was efforts to actually get journalists on the ground to go and report on what had happened. You can't do that from your couch. You just can't. And we see this every time there's some sort of conflict, Afghanistan and the sort of withdrawal of the troops, right? The footage that came out of that, again, sometimes it's people with a camera phone, though we can talk about verification and some of the challenges there. But you do have this need to have some sort of authoritative first person, like I am on the ground, I'm seeing this thing, and I'm going to make an effort to fact check it and to tell the world what has happened. Now, they don't always get it right. I mean, again, around October 7th, you had some headlines that turned out to be egregiously misleading, right? The sort of game of telephone, the fog of war kind of situation. But what you start to see happen on Twitter, for example, is the big blue check accounts that spend a lot of their time trying to be first. They know that people are going to be there searching hashtags, right? They know that people are going to be doom scrolling. They know that people are going to be looking for information. And so what you would see is these kind of the more unethical among them would just grab footage and post it. And sometimes the footage wasn't even from the same war. There was stuff from Syria that was popping up and, being redescribed as being from Israel. And so you have these accounts that are getting, 20, 30,000 retweets because they're blue checked, right? They're sort of the way that the algorithm ranks content on Twitter now is foundationally different than it was 2.5 years ago or so. So there's that element. The creators are incentivized to get eyeballs because they are literally directly monetizing them at this point, right? So it's not you're not only competing for like fake internet points on Twitter, you're competing for like that rev share, right? And so you have the impact of that is that footage is just sort of haphazardly thrown out without context. And this is where you can have algorithmically curated content, but what you start to see is people becoming almost less informed. There may be a community note that will come out, but even the community notes people have to either be going and searching to see if the footage is old, or if they're not there, they have no idea if the footage is authenticatable or not. Again, so you're waiting for some sort of official fact check. So this is an ecosystem, and the incentives are complicated, but you see in these highly pivotal moments, you can see the breakdowns, and that I think is the thing that that people should be paying more attention to.
Yeah, I really like Community Notes, formerly, I think it was Birdwatch.
Which was a better name.
I loved that name. I loved it because, well, also I think there's still some confusion people have about Community Notes, because I've seen on memes that the community note is wrong. And I think people are slowly understanding that can be the dynamic. It's just like potentially more context, but sometimes it's stated very matter of fact.
I was actually a really avid user during election 2022. I spent a lot of time in election 2022 in community notes, paying attention to how they handled election rumors. It was kind of like part of my academic research that year. What you see happen is, so first there's a number of accounts that are approved to write notes. In order to be approved to write notes, you have to do a fair amount of rating notes, and you're, evidencing that you're like a participating member of the community. The way that a note is shown or not shown is if a sufficient number of raters that the algorithm has decided are ideologically diverse all agree that a note is a good quality note. And so there's a bunch of rating criteria. I definitely suggest anybody go sign up for the rating piece. If you're on Twitter, it's not hard and it's totally worth it. Because what you can see is things like, is this a neutral source, right? Is this a good source? Is this presented in a neutral way? Is the note fact-based? Does there need to be a note on this at all, right? But of course, what you do see sometimes is, depending on who is participating and how, you'll see notes get through that turn out not to be true, or you'll see a note get appended to a tweet and then people can say, no, that tweet didn't deserve a note. So you've seen, particularly with Elon, sometimes you'll see a note go up, but then the note will disappear.
Yep.
And so sometimes there's some concern that that's because people with large numbers of fans are in there trying to shift, to get the note kind of taken off. That's not supposed to be able to happen because there's, again, supposed to be that diversity, that ideological or viewpoint diversity in play. But that's not always how it seems to shake out.
Yeah, when it comes to algorithms too, because this dynamic between influencers, algorithms, and crowds, I used to be of the camp where it's like, in some way you have a lot of control over your algorithm. If you don't want to see something, like, swipe by it really quick and it won't, like, that type of stuff won't be shown to you eventually. But increasingly, as like these recommendation algorithms, even on tweets or whatever, like, consider watch time, and they consider just hovering over a piece of content, clicking into a piece of content, not actually engaging with it via retweet, like, bookmark, whatever it is, then I'm like, it gets into more like murky subconscious territory because I chose not to take an action on this, but just the fact that I read it in full and spent some time over it, like, it's going to feed me more. And sometimes you easily give into temptation that way. When those are kind of like the algorithmic incentives, that's where it's like getting messier and more they're just trying to do these little nuances. So like they figure out how you can stay on there for as long as possible. And that definitely plays into like the culture war baits and everything. Like my Twitter For You page right now is just like not entirely culture war baits, but like more than I've ever seen on Twitter.
Yeah.
So it's absurd.
Well, and the phenomenon of like the hate watch or the hate click is is real. I had there was this app called Newsbreak. It still exists. And we were doing a little like investigative project on it a couple of years back. It was maybe 2 years ago now, because it had one of these things where like you could register yourself as a journalist and then it would boost your content. And so it was this idea that, everybody could publish and it was explicitly newsy. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it might have originated in China also. There were a couple different aspects of it that were interesting to me. And I signed up and I started getting emails, and it would present crime stories with the most like lurid headlines. And this was the kind of stuff where it's like rubbernecking, like the train wreck sort of situation, where I'd be like, what on earth is that story? And I would click on it. And then I started calling it the murder app, because all it would do from that point on in my email every day, I had like 3 or 4 times a day these like horrific murder stories, particularly child murders. It was really like boom in there with that stuff.
Delightful. Good morning.
Yeah. And again, like I said, it was like so over the top. Like the headline, what I assume was either AI generated, or maybe 2 years ago they had people doing it, but it was happening quickly. So I assume it was an automated process by that point. It just created this sense of like, I eventually unsubscribed. I was like, I don't want the murder app in my inbox like 3 times a day. And I wonder like what other people got when they were engaging with that, because it creates this like perception of American carnage that, you see like nothing but murder stories in your inbox 3 times a day. And this is just email. This is not even social media where you open your feed and like it's right there in front of you. But it was so pronounced in the in this particular experience I had with this inbox, where I was like, I don't even like seeing the headlines. It just became sort of like why am I doing this to myself? For work, obviously, but let me when the project was done, I unsubscribed pretty quickly.
You dive into like all these other interesting examples, whether it's Wayfair, which every time I go on Wayfair now, I'm like, it's still in the back of my mind, that whole entire viral controversy. Because to your point, it's like I never really saw the resolution of what happened there, or even just, how Candace Owens, Steven Crowder, Daily Wire, and so on. I had a situation actually where Steven Crowder cherry picked one of my TikTok videos. Like, I post some fun casual videos on there. I've posted dance videos. It's maybe 1 out of 15 videos, but cherry picked the dance videos, didn't watch any of my like actual analysis or reporting. I was like, all right, great.
That happens a surprising amount. I write about that a little bit in the book, but definitely much more lately, because you get turned into like a weird character when that happens.
Yeah.
And they pick something that they can latch onto. If you're a woman or you're young, or particularly if you're a woman and young, it's the idea that you're some kind of like intellectual lightweight. I remember seeing criticism of one woman that I know because she wore red lipstick, which was, obviously a thing that only,
it's like my mind doesn't even go there. to critique that. It's like,
I don't see that sort of personalization. I've seen women critiqued because of their hair, their gender presentation. You wear too much makeup. You're trying too hard, too little makeup. You're not trying hard enough, and you definitely see it. I'm sorry it happened.
I was laughing about it by the end of the day. At first I was a little alarmed, but okay. But even generally the dynamic, I think you used an example like Guitar Guy, and how he started playing his music online and then dabbled in like during COVID, just like more controversial topics, saw the engagement spike, and kind of just went in the rabbit hole of the short-term game where, you go maybe too deep into a niche, the audience you build wants those controversial topics, you find yourself like almost like imprisoned by that, and you can't really go back to even playing your music because now they want the controversial topics. And I think you say, one of the quotes is, "This is why the person you initially followed for makeup tips weighs in on the Russia-Ukraine war, COVID vaccines, and now U.S. inflation and the Israel-Gaza conflict with equal confidence." But I think, and that's 100% at play. But I think, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts there. There's another dynamic where there's also crowd pressure. Yeah. It still files into what you just said, but funnels into what you just said. I think we saw this most intensely with the Black Lives Matter movement in June of 2020, posting the black square, changing your profile picture. If you weren't, that was bad. And now with people want their influencers who give makeup tips to speak on the Israel-Gaza conflict, and they'll flood the comments continuously. And it's this conversation of, yes, you're not experts, but there's been enough time for you to educate yourself. How do you look at that? Is that consumer crowd outlook valid, or how do you see that dynamic?
It's interesting. There's a parasociality to it. By which I mean the crowd feels that they have a relationship with you and you owe them something. I am not an influencer. I have followers on social media platforms, but I feel like it's a different relationship. Yep. There's not a deep personal connection between me and people I talk to a lot most of the time. But I've gotten a few of these, why aren't you weighing in on X, in the DMs? And my response is always, because I don't think I have, because if I have expertise or something to say, I'll say it. And if I don't, then I won't. And I'm not interested in doing performative things regardless of where my independent politics are. That's, I think, a thing that I can say quite directly and plainly, and I do. But I also don't monetize any of my social feeds, right? Having somebody unfollow me is not a really big deal in that same way. Whereas what you see and hear from influencers, I talked to Jonathan Van Ness on his podcast, and that was, a month and a half, 2 months ago now. Getting Curious is the name of his podcast. But what was interesting about it was he was talking about having that experience and how it made him feel like he had to kind of tiptoe around topics, and there was no pleasing any one group of people, and it created a lot of stress and pressure for him. And he felt that there was nothing that he could say that was right. And I think that that's a very common experience that people have. I don't think it's a particularly healthy relationship. There's also, what I think is a little bit strange about it also is the idea that your influencer speaking out is going to change that policy. Sometimes you can grow a movement and call attention to things, but usually there has to also be some carryover. What is the next thing that you're doing? Are you are you posting the black square, or are you lobbying your congressman to take an action or pass a bill? Are you posting the black square, or are you doing a fundraising drive to help get aid to people, or to call attention beyond a single social media post, or expressing the viewpoint that the crowd wants you to have? I think that resisting that audience capture is challenging, but really critical. And I think that it does become, particularly for influencers who make a living off their social media posts, something that becomes very fraught for them. And they either self-censor, or if they aren't doing a full-throated commitment, they're going to get attacked anyway for not saying the right thing, even if they do try to post. So it's a very real dynamic that's happening today.
And you detail this in the book of like the right seems to be typically more savvy with social media. And maybe it's because it's like kind of rebelling on feeling left out from, Hollywood and mass media, legacy media. And so there is that dynamic of like the Daily Wire. It's not independent media necessarily. It's like new media, but there's like nothing necessarily like that on the left, like what they've built on the right. Why do you think the right is more savvy with social media?
You see some of it. I mean, there's definitely some, particularly on the far left. You'll see some streamers that are huge.
For sure.
Young Turks is another example of like these brands that kind of come up in the age of the internet. I think it's part of it is the internet rewards that sort of freewheeling, say what's on your mind, mix it up a little bit, spicy takes, that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you've ever seen, like, compare the feeds from like the New York Times and legacy media, which are still largely just sort of tweeting out their headlines, and they're not engaging with some of the others, where they're replying in the Facebook comments, right? They're replying on Twitter. There's a much more direct relationship. It just understands social media as social, as opposed to as yet another channel for broadcasting. And that, I think, is one of the key differences. It didn't used to be that way also, right? President Obama had a pretty, I think Destin, if I'm not mistaken, interviewed him at one point. I think a few people did interviews with President Obama, the sort of YouTube generation. And that was like a big thing for the campaign to reach out and show that connection. So for a while, there was there were those influencer relationships that were quite visible. I think on the flip side, though, I do think you see new media that came up on the internet as like internet first, understanding how to engage very, very differently than what's happening more in the center. I don't think the center is really invested in it quite as much as it should have, because again, it had all of the other, all the other outlets and reach for such a long time.
You've had extensive experience within the rumor mill online and such.
Yep.
And I think it's fascinating, though it's like, I feel like we could talk about that for an hour in itself. And I think it might be something that's like better linked. You did a really great conversation with Taylor Lorenz recently, and I feel like I can link people to that. But I was surprised that even despite you having gone through that experience yourself, that you still believe people within your industry, researchers and so on, who, have this expertise, should be online and should be communicating with people. I think it was like an intern or something had asked you, and at the time you were hesitant because you're like, look, I went through harassment and doxing and stalking situations. Should I promote this to people? But you're like, it's like a part of the job now. And I think increasingly a part of so many jobs. I know people in nursing professions who it's being added to their resumes that they need to also be or the job descriptions that they should also be posting on social media. It's just like everyone is kind of slowly moving that way, which is also a very interesting like social globalization dynamic. And you also say, don't think that it won't come for you or your field, industry or brand. It will. So how do you think like people should think about that dynamic and how they should present themselves online?
I think people need to be really clear-eyed about both the value of engaging and the potential costs of engaging. Whenever we've done projects at SIO, we are really clear, like, if you put your name on this, you're potentially exposing yourself to harassment. And that's even if it's a state actor analysis, right? Here's a demonstrable attributed Russian or Chinese influence operation or wherever it comes from. If you put your name on it, you expect that there might be some blowback. We want you to really understand like what a lot of this work entails. If you're doing something that goes after a domestic political faction, like I've never really worked on right-wing extremism, but that's a research area, and people who work in that space take all sorts of different precautions to try to make sure that their information is not on the internet. If you have kids, questions about, what are the, what happens if you've posted your kids to social media in the past, right? I was watching a YouTuber do a pregnancy announcement the other day. Somebody I've sort of followed over the years and started paying more attention to because she was a victim of a lot of non-consensual deepfake porn.
Mm-hmm.
And she was both telling her 5 million subscribers about how excited she was to be having a baby. And, they watched her date, get married, now she's having this baby. And she was really upfront that like she's never going to say the kid's real name on her channel. She's never going to post a picture of him. And that's because this is like, she has chosen a very, very public life, particularly with 5 million followers, but she does not want, she also sees the very, very real downsides and challenges. So the problem that we have is that you both want normal people with deep domain expertise to get on social media and share it, right? You want doctors saying, hey, this is how you should think about your sunscreen. Mm-hmm. Here's how you should think about your birth control. Here's like an actual informed opinion on that versus that influencer who normally talks about like shoes all of a sudden has strong opinions about birth control. And that's great for her. But here's like, let's try to ground it in some facts over on this channel. And you want people to do that at the same time. The recognition that if you touch on topics that are potentially controversial, or even if you're just in a profession that is under attack, right? You see a lot of librarians and teachers getting tagged these days, that there's a real risk to it. So I think we need to do better. I think the online harassment problem has a real chilling effect. It is really actually an affront to free speech. And I think that as long as harassment culture continues to expand and you can push people out of conversations, that's one of the big free speech topics that we actually need to be talking about a whole lot more.
Yeah, it's people get completely silenced. And it is always, cancel culture is definitely a thing on, I know like there's like a debates about that. But typically people, with bigger audiences, they get to a point where they can't necessarily be canceled. But other people, yes, they don't vanish off the face of the earth. What, do you want them to die? Like, no, they just, their life gets derailed.
Right.
And I just think it's interesting how when people are disliked by the masses, the thing that everyone wants to go for is their job. And it's like, I think it's going to become more and more normal that people go through a negative online experience. There was that quote of like, in the future, everyone's going to be famous for 15 minutes or whatever. And now it's like, in the future, everyone's going to be canceled for 15 minutes. Like, are we always going to react by someone, losing their partnerships, losing their job? Like, we also just like social dynamics of that need to understand like that's going to be more normal. And we can't just have those reactions when you see, I don't know, an employee, getting dogged on online.
This is the challenge with a lot of the institutions, right? Is they're very happy that you have visibility when you're non-controversial and you're calling attention to work or the institution or what have you. But then the minute the internet comes for you, they don't really understand what to do. And
it's awkward.
It is. And there's a sense of like, they don't really know how to support.
Yes.
But more than that, there's like, you get the sense that like they kind of wonder if you did something to deserve it somehow.
Yeah. And it's valid. It's like, okay, you want to trust people. You want to trust like people's judgments. Yeah, why are all these people coming at you? It's like a normal human reaction to have.
My experience with it, and I talk about this in the book, was like when the rumors started about some of our work on the 2020 election and this idea that like, for me it was that I was some like spooky CIA agent who had been like placed at Stanford by the CIA for the sole purpose of like leading a deep state cabal to censor conservative speech, right? And now I've been very online since I was in middle school. And, I feel like I had an intuitive sense of how to react, which was like, I should be making fun of this. I should be calling attention to it. I should be helping my supporters and people on my quote unquote side see the absurdity of what's about to happen. And more importantly, because I am like, in an academic role, I can contextualize it through like, here's how I would think about this if I was looking at it through an outside lens. Now it's happening to me, but here's how I would suggest someone respond. At the same time, in that moment, I sort of felt like I was supposed to be deferential to the quote unquote comms professionals, right? Because naturally they know more than I do. They're communications professionals. And then I've had this moment a few times in my life where you're like, okay, well, like the adults will come in and someone will know what to do. And then you realize that like, no, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen at all. Like you're really kind of on your own actually, because institutional comms has been told that the answer is to shut up and say nothing.
Yep.
And that's because they think that like some media cycle is going to pass, and they don't realize that that's not how the world works today, that this is not like the New York Times writing an unflattering profile of me that will then be forgotten 3 days later. Rather, this is something where you become a character in a cinematic universe, and you're useful to people as a character, as a tool, as part of a conspiracy theory, and they're going to harp on you forever. And if you don't say something, you're just indicating that you're never going to fight back. And then the lies continue to propagate, the rumors continue to propagate, and you're not getting any of your side out there into the world. And that's where I think there really needs to be a pretty strategic shift, a pretty significant overhaul in how institutions think about this. Because again, it's going to come for individuals, but the institution is where the individuals sit and do their work. And so it's going to reflect on the institution. And the institution doesn't know how to cope with that yet. And that's where you start to see people who, when it happens to them, all of a sudden, the experience is very, very, very similar. I think most of us who've been targeted have had it, which is like your institution really just doesn't know what to do. And so they do nothing. And that's the default.
There's the big topic of, freedom of speech versus freedom of reach. And you also say that America's free speech tradition is predicated on the idea that fact and falsehood will meet in the marketplace of ideas, that both will be heard, and that good ideas will overcome the bad. However, our current communication ecosystem hinders that process. And you talk about how something will happen, the rumor mill will start, and these are like huge rumors in order to show all the research, show all, the nuances and details of like why this is not true. That could take, minimum 48 hours, which is a lifetime in social media, or like way more. How do you see that moving forward? There's so many solutions. This can be like a freaking 4-hour conversation. We can't even hit the tip of the iceberg, but just like kind of hitting on that for people.
I have always been, since I started writing about this in like 2015, I've written about it from the standpoint of design, actually. I don't think that there's a particularly useful role for regulation. That's where you actually get into concerns about the First Amendment, right? When the government comes in and makes some sort of law or tries to make platform, some of the reform suggestions around CDA 230 and other things we just had 2 court cases about this, the net choice cases that SCOTUS heard, where the Supreme Court actually kind of affirmed that content moderation and curation is platforms speaking, right? Platforms deciding what they're going to carry. There's some real trade-offs to that, right? We're basically acknowledging that massively powerful private actors, unaccountable private actors, really shape the speech environment that we all live in through their own right, if you will, to speech, to deciding what to carry. And so if you think about it in those terms, then what does that mean about how they make those determinations? So the reason that you see both the right and the left fighting so hard, whether it's passing, frivolous laws or advocating for laws that don't suck, but, or maybe borderline sometimes, the reason you see a lot of that happening, or even just lobbying platforms to make decisions, is because they recognize that there's real world implications to what platforms decide to curate. So there are intersections with the speech of ordinary users as well. The reason design becomes interesting is that you get at questions like when a platform is deciding what to curate or how to moderate. So curation, just to distinguish for people, is when the platform is just deciding either what to recommend or how to rank a feed, right? Both of these things are the platform algorithmically exercising a determination around what you're going to see. So nearly all feeds are ranked. The platform can choose from millions of posts to decide what to put at the top of your page. And that's what you're going to see, right? And that's potentially going to shape your mood. It has an impact. So some of the reasons why I've written about design for ages now is that you can change what goes into that weighting function. And sometimes you say that and people get very upset as if it's like sacrosanct, The weighting we've had for the last 8 years must not be shifted in any way. That's crazy. Like, why not? This is a private company with a private, determining of its own volition and in line with its own business interests, what you're going to see. Why is that sacrosanct? It's not. So how can we think about that? And this is where I think arguing around bridging algorithms even, how do you surface content that might highlight an important dispute or disagreement, that marketplace of ideas, but not do it in a way that just kind of demonizes the opponent, right? It's not, we feel this way about abortion, so you should go attack this other person over here. It's, we feel this way about abortion, and here's why, right? And so you can envision platforms thinking about curation much more in terms of the tone or the type or the framing of the content as opposed to just what's getting the most engagement. And it fundamentally shifts the type of experience people have. And I think we should be experimenting more with that sort of thing.
I feel like we have not even hit the tip of the iceberg. Everyone needs to go read Invisible Rulers because one day I will be able to sit down for 3-hour conversations, but that day is not today. The book is awesome. I think it is, like I said, such a great extension of manufacturing consent for the modern day, and I think everyone needs to read it. Do you have anything else to say?
No, I really appreciate it. I always like talking to people about these topics. I'm on Threads, Blue Sky, and Mastodon mostly these days, but and LinkedIn. Everybody's on LinkedIn again, which is weird.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to talk about. Like, I got through like 10% of this, and then Threads versus Twitter, and I have some takes. We'll talk about it one day. Yeah. But thank you so much,
Renee.
Thank you
for having me.